All right, so welcome everybody to February's Maine MTSS Implementation Toolbox Series session. So if you haven't been to a toolbox session before, then I just like to explain that I do start each toolbox session out with a review of Maine's framework for equity-based school supports. It's a 541 framework that includes the 5 critical components of MTSS, the 4 delivery pillars, and then we talk a little bit about this big idea of the big idea that we're really trying to move to in terms of our MTSS. And I do start every session out with this framework because I do like to try to point the toolbox part back to the framework so that you can understand so that when you leave, you can feel like there's been a connection between like what we talked about and how it may support the implementation of the 541 framework. So what we'll do is we're going to cover the critical components, delivery pillars, the big idea, and then we'll head into one way that I like to visualize a continuous improvement model. And because we only have an hour, a little less than an hour, by the time we're done doing some reflection, and then possibly opening it up to questions at the end, I like to try to keep the tools relatively simple visually and easy to use. Okay, so Maine's MTSS implementation framework has 5 critical components. When I talk about the differences between tiers, I am assuming that you are using a layering process where students that move from one tier of intensity to another, that we're talking about instructional intensity and not places or groups. But the first critical component for Maine's implementation framework is that schools have leadership teams that use live data to improve teaching and learning. And so the sooner that we can use the data to make decisions, the better off we are, or the better the likelihood that we are actually going to match an intervention to an actual need. So this is things like your iReady data if you're using it, or your map, your NWEA map data if you're using it. Like your dibbles and like those kinds of things that are really more in-house data sources that you're collecting, whatever those may be for your district or your school. The second critical component is that schools utilize a school-wide and a grade level team structure that is used to evaluate universal instructional integrity. It evaluates student response to instruction and supports and identify growth areas for instructional practice. But within the MTSS implementation framework, you really want to utilize some grade level teams that are really looking at the grade level data so that you can get a good sense of like a temperature sense of how the tier 1 is going across that grade level, because you can't have good tier 2 and tier 3 decisions without good tier 1 decisions. And so really implementing that grade level team as a part of the school-wide team really is a critical component of this. The third critical component is that schools prioritize effective universal instruction, otherwise known as Tier 1, for all students regardless of IEP, 504, multi-language, etc., and ensure relevant and timely access to additional and intensified support when indicated. And so really taking the time to look at system structures, scheduling structures, those kinds of things, grouping structures, all hands on deck to really ensure that as much as humanly possible that students remain in the tier 1 for tier 1 instruction with support, accommodations, tools, learning tools, things like that. Number 4, if you're not overwhelmed already, number 4 is actually big. It's big and it's not necessarily the easiest to put into place. But it's really like encompassing this idea that schools have a library of evidence-based resources to ensure equitable access for all students, regardless of eligibility for special education or other student supports. Say, okay, only students in tier 2 or tier 3 can have access to this program, but our data is indicating that program has some lessons or some components to it that could really help the tier 1 setting. We really are missing an opportunity. Another way to think of it is that if you or I were to walk into your local library, everything within that library is there for us to consume or is there for us to have depending on the need that we walked in for. So whether I'm going in as somebody with teenagers to the children's section because I've got maybe a niece and nephew coming by, or I have some younger cousins coming by and I want to get children's books, I'm not going to have the librarian coming up to me and saying, well, you really don't need to be in the children's section because your children are not reading that level anymore. And really so it's kind of weird how we pigeonhole certain things, but it's not easy because certain programs are bought with certain budget lines and somebody paid for this and somebody bought that and somebody's using this over here and there's not enough materials. And so number 4 is a critical component, but that resource mapping process that schools go through really is important in ensuring that number 3 critical component can actually be as effective as we would want it to be. And then number 4, that schools are creating dynamic partnerships with families, community members that are designed to support and empower families and community members. And so thinking about and the keyword there being dynamic, we really want to ensure that our partnerships with families and communities are multiple directions and that they're not static forms of including parents and family members, community members, caretakers of children, things like that. And thinking about putting those critical components into motion and really starting to get them up and off the ground so that we can use them and benefit from them. We've got to put something underneath them that's going to get them to move. And so that's sort of why this is like a wheel here. But these are the delivery pillars that really need to be in motion in order for your critical components to gain any leverage. This is loosely based on implementation science and also the critical implementation drivers that maybe if you know implementation science, and you may know that there are 3 drivers that are part of the implementation science framework. And so embedded within the 4 delivery pillars that you see on the screen are the 3 scientifically backed implementation drivers that are needed in order to successfully implement an initiative, much like MTSS. And at any point in time, if one of these pillars is disabled or gets a chunk of a piece taken out of it or is no longer rounded, it's going to mean that your system is not going to roll and flow properly, to get those critical components sort of in motion. Almost like a flat tire, right? So you can drive on a flat tire, but it's certainly not going to make the car very efficient. So starting on the right-hand side, I usually start over here with the needs-based decision making. So one of the 4 pillars is that schools are utilizing a needs-based decision-making process, and that this needs-based decision-making process is consistent across the school. So remember with the critical component number 2, when we were talking about the school-wide and grade level teams that are working together to analyze data for decision making, both of those teams would be utilizing the same decision making process from kindergarten to 12th grade. This process should be consistent and can be used to create systems for making decisions for problem solving within your MTSS. Looking at educator support, you cannot have a full functioning MTSS without a robust educator support pillar. It's A plus B equals C, so that really we often think that our MTSS is about intervention. It's about the intervention materials. It's about matching the intervention for the students. And while that is part of it, the adults are the ones that are really and truly going to be the success of your MTSS. Over on the left-hand side, we've got shared leadership. This is basically saying that in our school, we are all hands on deck, and that it's all administrators, all educators, all students, and all family hands on deck all the time. And really, how can we encompass that we're all in this together to move our students forward towards their goals, towards our goals, towards the goals that we have for them, they have for themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the top is our common learning framework. And this is really developing that tiered system for academic behavior, social, emotional, and even attendance growth. So a full-scale MTSS that uses a consistent needs-based decision-making process and incorporates shared leadership really can be used for problem solving and matching of intervention to need for academics, behavior, social emotional learning and supports, and also attendance supports. MTSS isn't something that a school does, it's something a school is. Is anybody interested in sort of sharing some of their thoughts that they were thinking about during their self-reflection?
I'll share. We're currently going through this in my district, trying to define MTSS, kind of what we want the model to look like, and how do we kind of educate everyone on the differences between RTI and MTSS, and how, people see that there's still tiers and we're still talking about that, and they're still kind of in that intervention type mindset. And how do we shift that, and how do we change the lens of that quality core instruction so that most kids, that's adequate, and then we just have a small percentage of kids that need extra, where right now it's looked at in sort of we're only looking at the kids who need extra, and how do we move them, and not kind of shifting the whole model type thing. So we're working on that currently.
So, like at the beginning of the toolbox session, and I talked about the triangle on the side, and that when I talk about the tiers, to understand that um, the way that I'm using the tiers, the way that I'm portraying the concept of the tiers, is that they are going to layer each other and get more intensified as you go up. Thing that I get a lot of pushback on is that when it comes to thinking about your full scale MTSS, um, I am operating from what I am calling the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule simply being that when you have high quality, high leverage instruction and instructional practices, and you have highly trained teachers, and you have research-based, evidence-based curricula and instructional materials that you're using, research shows us if everything were working the way that it should be working, 80% of our students, regardless of whether they're receiving multiple levels of intervention and or have IEPs, they should be able to access and meet benchmarks. 80%, 80% of the population should be able to be successful in the tier one setting with the things that we provide to the tier one setting. And that there are repercussions that happen when we aren't at 80%, right? That's overtaxing, like overextending the way that we're using the resources. We run out of money faster, we run out of time faster. And we find that, we are doing more work just to keep the system going and not focusing on the instruction and the learning of the students that we're trying to serve. But there's always going to be a part of the population that's going to need extra, that's going to need that something else that we have to provide to them. The 80-20 is I get a lot of pushback on that because people are like, there's no way that we're getting to 80%, or my students are we're only at 40% that are meeting expectations or whatever. And it's like, okay, we understand that. And to write a goal with 80% in mind may not meet that SMART goal that we've been taught, something that we're looking to attain. Have that bigger goal always in sight, because the decisions that we make on the ground to get us to that goal should be designed to get us to that goal and then meet the little ones sort of along the way. And so this continual improvement model that we're going to go through today is going to function on those two premises that we talked about. So that the tiers layer themselves, and that we're operating from an 80-20 perspective. Like, we're looking to get to 80%. The decisions that we're making are going to try to get us to that 80%. And so the very first part of this continuous improvement model is providing that tier one instruction, core curriculum, accessible and differentiated instruction, formative assessments, universal screening, and that we're analyzing that tier one data at least 3 times a year. And what we're looking for is a positive response. And in this case, a positive response would be considered that 80% are meeting or exceeding benchmark with core instruction. If that's happening, you continue with tier one. Whatever, whatever world you're living in, if you're getting that 80%, you would continue what you're doing. What happens when you get a poor response? So for me, that's going to be like 60% or less. So less than 60% of your fifth graders are meeting benchmark in math or literacy or whatever it is. And then you may say, well, why not, why 60% and not 80%? And that's because if you're somewhere in that middle of like 60 to 80%, the efforts that you have to make are probably smaller and more short term than the efforts that you're going to have to make for if you're living in a world where you've got larger numbers that are below. And so the second part of the continuous improvement model is that we have to investigate the effectiveness of the universal setting. And many times, what we do is we look at our student data and we say, okay, where's the bottom 25? And how can I provide extra supports to the bottom 25 and assume that the upper 75 is, they're doing okay with what we're doing. That is a learner-centered approach, which is not a bad thing to have. You'll always have that. But in a full-scale continuous improvement model, there are three other areas that we have to like actively pursue and answer some questions as part of continuous improvement of the school in order to be able to continue to move on with this particular model. And that is, we have to explore the environment that students are learning in. We have to explore the curriculum that's being used, and we have to explore the instruction that's happening. And this is important because for every decision that you make at tier one, there should be an evaluation of the environment in which it's happening, the curriculum that's being used, and the instruction that's happening. And once all of those things are answered, and if we find no problems with those at all, then we would just continue to do what we're doing, and then we can go to that we can rely heavily on that learner-centered model. But in many cases, we may find that there are things that are problematic in one of these areas or more of these areas, including our student evaluations that we will need to continue to do. So it's called the ISIL method, but the L is silent. So the L is there, but the L is silent when we're looking at tier one problem solving and tier one continuous improvement. So the ISIL being I, instruction, C, curriculum, E, environment, and then L for learner. So then once we have done this evaluation, we're going to come up with some hypotheses. Like, we're going to hypothesize like, well, maybe the reason why student support or student, achievement is less than expected is because, there are a lot of interruptions that are happening during that block, or gee, like we always schedule assemblies during that block, or we always have something else that happens during that time, or, kids are coming and going, and there's a lot of transitions during that time. And so as you uncover problems within that tier one setting, you would come up with an intervention for that problem that may not necessarily be specific student related. So it may be looking at an instructional barrier that you uncovered and coming up with an intervention for that instruction, or you're coming up with an intervention for the environment. And so when it comes to that continuous improvement model, as we look at it from a tier one perspective, in many cases, it's the system at tier one that needs the intervention and less the students that are needing the individual interventions. And so that's pretty important. So we're going to problem solve the issues that we've uncovered, and we're going to do a tier one intervention at the whole group level. And we're going to go ahead and monitor and implement that tier one intervention. And then over time, a little bit of time is going to go by. And then usually at tier one is 3 times a year. So you've got the fall, the winter, and then the spring. And so you would rescreen at one of those markers to see, is the intervention that we're doing on the environment, or the intervention that we're doing for the curriculum, or the intervention that we're doing for instruction, is it getting the response that we're looking for? A positive response would mean that the students as a group are inching closer to that 80% mark. And if they're not, or you're not seeing the results that you're looking for at the tier one level, you have to go back to your investigation and look again and see, did we really intervene in the way that we thought we were intervening? Or did we hypothesize some things that really we couldn't change? It wasn't valid, or we weren't able to validate it. And so we're trying to fix something that has too many outside factors that we don't have control over. And then the cycle would just continue to repeat, and you would just continue to repeat and then and intervene at that whole group level. And for every tier 2 decision or tier 3 decision that you make, there has to be a tier 1 decision that's supporting it, especially if you're below that 80% mark. So I'd like to open it up for folks to kind of, you can have some time to think, you can have some time to ask some questions. But this is really your opportunity to kind of process what we talked about, and then hopefully send you off with a clear thought of how you might use this tool in your settings. Any thoughts or gut reactions that are coming up for folks?
I'm wondering if you have a suggestion, sorry, on how to have a conversation like this or facilitate a conversation like this. Because I'm thinking, like in my school, I can think of a classroom that my hypothesis for them is that their classroom management needs some improvement. And that could be part of the problem for lack of achievement. But this process seems to really take some good sort of like self-awareness and analysis and being willing to change. Like, do you just have any like pointers or suggestions for facilitating a conversation like this?
Yeah, it's a hard conversation, especially if it comes down to teacher behavior. And if you think that the thing that needs to change is teacher behavior. And so it's tough because you have to, it's hard for me to be able to give specific like examples of how to approach a certain teacher because like human interactions are so nuanced. So it would be difficult because you're going to know that person better than I know that person. But I will say that, for example, I have during a cohort that I was working with, she was part of this like implementation cohort that I did last year, and um, it just kept coming back to environment. She had issues in the environment, and she just was like, I have certain teachers that I could tell them to, go turn off the water faucet, and they're like, it's fine if the water keeps running. So there is something to keep in mind that so when thinking about when you come up with your hypothesis, you're going to have multiple opportunities to come up with that hypothesis. So you're going to come up with hypothesis at the school level, team data, like level, and then you have to come up with a hypothesis or bring that hypothesis to the 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 grade level team, and then have the grade level team really help be part of that exploration that has to happen with that hypothesis. But the hypothesis has to meet four criteria. So it needs to be grounded in research. So we know that this is like, it's going to be an area that somebody else probably has had this problem at some point in time. And like they've been able to work through kind of getting through, the, the problems with that hypothesis. It has to be um, alterable. So when you're hypothesizing and you come up with a hypothesis and then you say to yourself, if we fix this, then we should see, improvements in our student data or improvements in our growth or improvements over here. The thing that you're trying to fix has to be something that you have the power within the building to fix. So like my example with the Northern Maine school, you know, really did come down to an environment problem that she was coming up with. And so we had to really dig in to figuring out what parts of the environment can you change that may be able to help. Because if you can't change the behavior of that teacher or that classroom or something, you're kind of barking up the wrong tree, right? And so you really have to think about when you're coming up with a hypothesis, asking yourself, is this something that actually we have the power to change? And when it comes to like that interpersonal behavior of teachers, that comes down to really trying to build an interpersonal relationship with somebody. Like you've got to work on like the relationship building with that person, you build a rapport with them, and really sort of like think about, how can you how do people change? Like, how are people willing to see things from your point of view? And so it really comes down to that interpersonal piece, which I think from a MTSS perspective may feel like, well, that's so far beyond providing intervention for my students. But if that's the thing that needs to happen, then that's the thing that needs to happen. And oftentimes we'll say, that's so far removed. Like, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to buy this new program and this is going to fix it. Or I'm going to do this and this is going to be okay. And so when I talked earlier about like that educator support piece of the pillar being critical to the delivery pillars, that's what I mean. Is that sometimes the answers that we need are ones that are going to feel so remote to the student needs that are in front of you, but understanding that that might be the piece the that has to have the first level of intervention done to it, right? And so I don't know if that answers your question. But it really comes down to like, and I hate like, oh, build relationships because like I feel like that's a buzz phrase now. But sometimes when it feels like this is the thing that I know has to happen and it feels really remote to what I wanted to be doing, kind of owning that and being like, hey, just because I wanted to work on, this with this group of students maybe the intervention is actually something over here that has to happen first. And so doing that work to make that happen.